get on going, I'm just going to welcome everybody and say hi. I'm Mary Lloyd, and I'm with Impact 100 Seattle. I am our education member, education chairperson, and I've got a fabulous committee of folks. Julie Pham, I see on this call. She's one of my committee folks. Thank you all for coming. We are super excited about what we're going to be talking about today. You'll see a few Impact members here. I want to thank Anna Graves, who's with us today. She's a co-founder of Impact 100 Seattle, and she's going to be assisting me and the whole panel with some technology. And we are both manning the chat room. So please, if you've got questions or want to share information, we'll be watching that as well. We're a part of Impact 100, and I wanted to just say one of the things I love about my role in the education chair role is that I get to put my little research hat on and often delve into some topics, pressing issues, and I get to meet the most interesting community members doing just some really dynamic things out there. So today's topic on serving refugees is just that. I can't tell you how much I've learned already. The importance of this topic, we really believe, is now. And coming off of the pandemic, when really no one traveled, no one was leaving. We're in this process of opening up again. Recent world events fraught with strife, U.S. hasty exit from Afghanistan, the war in Ukraine, the last 3 days in Sudan, not to mention anything that's climate related, whether it's an earthquake or anything that's economically in terms of disparity. These are all endangering people in a variety of ways. And although we're not on the southern border as Washington, we are a border state, and Washington is a sanctuary state open to those that are displaced and seeking refuge. So what does that on our sort of local demographic look like? I was just reading in the New York Times recently, it was a March 31st issue, and they mentioned King County. And this was news to me that during COVID, our population in King County would have decreased if we had not been so welcoming to refugees at that time. So it really was a white flight. And there are so many dimensions to this. If you're looking at a tax base, if you're looking at it from a population and who's in and makes up our communities. So I have to admit from the beginning, I wasn't so sure the difference between an immigrant and a migrant. I know this is super complicated. So we know there's a lot of fear around this. In terms of a topic, there's lots of questions. It's massive, and we're only here for an hour. So this is not comprehensive, but there's urgency here. We really believe that. It's complicated, and yet we really feel by the end of the call today, you'll have some tangible action steps that we think that you can take. And we hope to encourage you to do that because it does take the village, government, large private organizations, small community-based organizations, sharing this load and all picking up different pieces where they can. I'm going to turn it over to Melissa West. She's our moderator today. She is an Impact founder. She has also been an experienced leader in nonprofits and with NGOs. Her family recently sponsored an Afghan family here in Seattle. So then she's going to introduce our panelists today. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Melissa.
Awesome, thank you. And just to say a word about Impact 100, I think those of you who are joining are all members, but we always like to remind people that we envision a world where nonprofits spend time transforming communities and not fundraising. I've been on a couple calls today with small nonprofits, and we're sharing the woes of looking for funding, and especially to cover general operating costs. And that's what we're here to do, and to help make connections and build community. So with that, let's get into this amazing topic that Mary has put together for us and talk a little bit about our panelists. I am going to introduce them. I'll start with Erin since she's first on the screen. So Erin McKay is the World Relief Director of Resettlement. She's originally from Seattle, but she moved to Ireland, and that's where she got a degree in international human rights with a focus in refugee protection. She supported human rights in Jerusalem, worked in refugee camps on the Aegean Islands in Greece, and managed the migration policy at the European level for Oxfam International. So she comes with a ton of experience, and she's now welcoming people in Washington State. So welcome to Erin. Next, we have Lawanda Arai. She's with this is a mouthful, so we call it OIRA, but Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs for the city of Seattle. Lawanda was born in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. She finished high school in South Seattle and attended UW. She was the first in her family to graduate from college, so congratulations. She's from a mixed status family, so she has diverse experience with immigration, including undocumented, being legal permanent residents, and then becoming US citizens. She also just spent 6 years serving on the board of the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, which has a big dinner tonight. So several of us are going to be attending that. And I think the tickets are out, but Ton may have an extra if you're really interested in learning more about the legal issues, which there are myriad. So next we have Ton Tan, and Ton has multiple roles, including for this panel, she is representing Viets for Afghans, which is a, we'll get into a little bit more of what they've done, but they're really an organization that came together out of the Afghan crisis to serve Afghan refugees specifically. But Ton is an Emmy Award winning journalist, producer, communicator, and storyteller. She is a daughter of Vietnamese refugees and created and hosted a podcast exploring Vietnamese American experiences after the Vietnam War. She co-founded Viet Fact Check, that's a mouthful, and Viets for Afghans, the coalition providing allyship and advocacy for Afghan refugees. And we'll talk a little bit about a series that she just produced, which is on KCTS. So the first question is one that I will start with and why I am moderating this panel, which is I got into working with refugees after the fall of Kabul in late 2021. The fall was in August, and a family of refugees came and stayed with us. This family had lots of complex needs, and through that process, I was able to engage with many different organizations serving the refugee community. So I've learned about the need to really bring together the nonprofit organizations, both large and small, the government support, those like Viets for Afghans that were working privately with families, but gained just a ton of experience. And that's how Ton and I initially met. But I think one thing I wanted to mention is that everybody's surprised when they hear how many refugees and immigrants are in our state. So Washington State has nearly 10% of all the refugees that are coming into the country. And for a state our size, that's huge. We've welcomed more than 16,000 Ukrainian refugees and 5,000 Afghans in the last year. And all of these people, along with the many other immigrants and refugees who are coming to our state, need to be supported and welcomed so they can be integrated into our communities and thrive. And so while we get started, I'm going to talk to the panelists first a little bit about what their connection is to immigrants and refugees, so you can hear it from their own words. And then we'll get into some more questions and have an opportunity for you to ask questions as well. So first, I'll start with Lawanda. Can you tell us a little bit about your personal connection to immigrants and refugees?
Absolutely. So as you mentioned in the intro, I am an immigrant myself. I moved to this country when I was a teenager. Prior to that, my family is originally from Brazil. We had lived in the UK as well. And so I feel like I've been an immigrant at least twice, although going back to Brazil sometimes makes me feel like an immigrant in a different way. So it is very personal. I think, when people hear that I was born in Rio and lived in London and think that there's this sort of like jet setting lifestyle, and and they make assumptions about how I sound and how I look. But the reality is that my family experienced significant periods of poverty, and I was undocumented for 8 years. And for a long time, I didn't know how to talk about that. There's a lot of shame, a lot of fear. And through my involvement with community-based organizations that serve immigrants and refugees, I really learned to tell my story and see those aspects of my life as an asset, as lived experience is expertise. And I really feel like I can, at the risk of using a trite, being trite, is I bring my whole self to work. And so that's why I do this work.
Thank you for sharing, and we really appreciate you being so open. Next, why don't we have Erin talk a little bit about your experience with immigrants and refugees and personal connection.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I have to start with saying I don't have lived experience of being a refugee. I came to this population a little naively in my first job right out of college. I worked at a homeless shelter. It's Mary's Place. You might be familiar with it. And at the time, several years ago, something like 40% of the people in our shelters were either newcomers in some way, new immigrants, or refugees who had gone through their period with the resettlement agency and hadn't been able to sustain themselves on their own. I remember looking around and again, very naively being so shocked at how I felt as though the US had failed this group of people who I got to know, and I felt privileged enough to help walk alongside them as they tried to build their lives here. And that's what really galvanized me to try and work with this population, which again, I've been privileged enough to never have to experience refugee flight, but I've committed to working with this population because I just am constantly blown away by resilience and kindness and the normalcy that people can live their lives after experiencing some of these really traumatic experiences. So I've been lucky enough, I got my degree in Ireland. I've worked with refugees in Israel, Palestine, Greece, Ireland at the European level, and then now in Seattle. So yeah, it's really a passion for me, and I'm very excited in this new role that I get to do direct service. So I'm working every day with the refugees that our organization serves.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Erin. Okay, last but not least, Tan, can you share a little bit about your personal experience with immigrants and refugees?
Sure. Hi there. Thank you to Impact 100 for having me here today. And I am a child of refugees, and my parents fled Vietnam a few years after the Vietnam War ended. So they escaped in 78 and were in a refugee camp for about 6 months, and were sponsored by family friends and by Catholic Charities and resettled here in Washington State. And I grew up raised by refugees within like the refugee community, but I was the first US citizen in my family. And so I consider myself very privileged in a lot of ways. And you grow up with this, and you grow up with people who are not US citizens. They're learning to become citizens. I have distinct memories of my sister. Whenever we went to Canada, she was a resident alien, and I used to make fun of her. And it took my parents more than 10 years to actually become US citizens. I remember them studying for the test. But I think that I grew up with this. I didn't really think about what it meant to be a refugee. I just knew that we were a refugee family, and that it was, in some ways, it was a little bit of that push that there's no excuse for you to not be successful in life and to not get an education and to not succeed, And so I feel that I sort of suppressed like any kind of meaning. You leave it behind, you don't think about it. And so now I'm 41 years old. And for me, the last 10 years especially has really been a very late awakening or reawakening, and trying to really process what it means to not just be a refugee, but to be affiliated, to be associated with refugees. And it's such a rich experience. And so I really didn't do that much. I mean, for me, it's been 10 years of trying to understand the Vietnamese refugee story. But as of August 2021, became very involved with the Afghan community, and that was very accidental. And so I think the shared lived experience has definitely come into play, but also learning the value of that shared lived experience and understanding the limitations as well, because we are two very different groups. And so as much as I believe we can learn from the past is prologue, but there's so much that still has to be improvised when it comes to helping refugees today. And sometimes grappling with that and dealing with that is really exhausting, as everyone on this panel understands in their own way. So excited to be here and to share more.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we're going to get into some of the complexities, I think. And for those of you who have not worked in this community, I just want to reiterate that it takes all of these types of organizations coming together and really working to integrate families in a way that helps them bring all of the amazing resourcefulness and resilience and energy and desire to be in this country together and to help them thrive. But they help us just as much. And it's just been such a rewarding experience. And I hope that we can share both sides of that, right? Because it's complex and it's also incredibly rewarding to be working in this space. So with that, can we talk a little bit about the role that each of your organizations play in supporting immigrants and refugees? And I think, Lawanda, I'm going to start with you. I know a lot of the refugees that come to this area don't necessarily sit in the city of Seattle, primarily because housing costs are so high. A lot of them are either further north or further south. So can you talk a little bit about what City of Seattle has been doing to support this community?
Of course, absolutely. So the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs really came about through community advocacy. There was a commission, an immigrant and refugee commission of the city, made up of local leaders that were, deeply embedded in immigrant and refugee communities, and their advocacy established the office in 2012 through ordinance. And we started out as a 2-person team. Now we're a 12-person team. I mean, in the grand scheme of the city of Seattle, that's tiny, but we have grown in these 11 years. And we don't really do direct services. We have sort of a external and internal book of business, as it were. Internally, we really are focused on making the city itself as an institution accessible to immigrant and refugee communities. So a major program that we run is our language access program, which means that every department in the city is required to plan for language access and then use our centralized database to translate material. So, we contract with local native speaking interpreters and translators, and make sure that, when the city's putting out information about everything, services, funding, elections, what have you, that those materials are translated into the languages most used by immigrants and refugees in the area. We're actually just doing a review of what are the top languages, and there isn't necessarily really clean, easy data. And we sort of have to continuously do these surveys. We rely a lot on Seattle Public Schools data about what languages are spoken at home. And I think it's really a little bit of a crown and the jewel of our department is the language access program. We also help city departments to connect with ethnic media outlets. So whether it's a Somali language YouTube channel or a Chinese language print paper, we want to make sure that things are translated and provided to these small businesses. So we're also buying ads and making sure other departments are buying ads there. On the other side of our sort of external facing work is we act as a funder. So we contract with community-based organizations to do work around citizenship. So getting legal permanent residents the support they need to apply and secure US citizenship. We do have a legal defense network, which is providing direct legal representation to people who are detained or at risk of deportation. And then we have a Ready to Work program, which is essentially combines language skills, English language skills, digital literacy skills, and job skills to act sort of as a bridge between just ESL classes and sort of vocational training. So a little bit of a bridge for those folks who need extra support. And then we are just launching a pilot focused on public safety. So we know that with the increase in community violence that we've seen since the pandemic started, immigrants and refugees are disproportionately affected, and it's much harder to access information and services in their preferred languages that are culturally responsive. And so we're piloting a project where we'll be working with some community-based organizations focused on that.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah.
And for a 12-person team, it sounds like probably really hard to get all of that done. And yet there's so much more that's needed to support the integration of these immigrants and refugees. So Erin, I think it would be great to hear a little bit from the kind of refugee resettlement perspective when you're really on the front lines of helping people, from the airport figure out where they go next. So tell us a little bit about how World Relief is supporting that.
Yeah, absolutely. So World Relief is one of 9 resettlement agencies that resettle refugees on behalf of the US government. So every year, you might hear there's a presidential determination on the number of refugees that they're hoping, big emphasis on hoping, to bring to the US. And so of that number, a percentage is allocated to each resettlement agency. World Relief has dozens of offices across the US, but our Western Washington office, which is where I'm based, is one of the largest. So just for background, we resettled 1,200 refugees last year, of which 900 were Afghan. So we all saw the influx around the end of the fall of Kabul and the end of 2021, beginning of 2022. And then we're also in a unique place, a privileged place where we have a very strong pipeline for Ukrainians as well. We have been resettling Ukrainians here since the early 1990s, and about 15% of our staff are Ukrainian. So we have we're uniquely tied to both communities, which we feel very privileged about. Our role as refugee resettlement agencies is to be the kind of, like Melissa just said, the kind of the first face, the first people taking care of these newcomers as they arrive. We have several programs. The first one is just called RNP, Resettlement and Placement, and that's the first 90 days of arrival. So a refugee comes with their family. Usually, we pick them up at the airport. We get them into their accommodation. We do everything from helping them access DSHS, accessing cash, accessing food. We help them enroll in ESL classes, enroll their children in school. They take cultural orientation classes through us, which talk about everything from what is 911 to here's the importance of seatbelts. And we provide employment classes. We have rental assistance programs. Our office is quite large here. I oversee a team of 40 who does everything from case management to housing coordination to we also furnish everyone's homes. So on top of it being very difficult to find affordable housing in Seattle, we furnish everyone's homes. Everything from that teaspoon to the rug, we source here. And then we also have additional programs that go beyond the 90 days. We have programs that support people with particular vulnerabilities. So anyone with complex medical issues or single parent households, we're able to support through, we call it intensive case management. And then World Relief, a little bit wider than resettlement, we do ESL here, we do job classes here, we have youth and family resources here. We have a very holistic view of how to serve this community, really making sure that we're not looking at a person and seeing a list of problems. We see a person who has a list of rights that we can help them access. Yeah, there's just a lot that our organization does. And if you're curious, there's more information on the website. I couldn't possibly scratch the surface of it all in a brief chat.
Thanks, Erin. That's already a lot, and we appreciate all you do and know how hard your team has been working, especially these last couple of years. It's been intense. Having been a host home myself for World Relief. So let's go to Tan. And Tan, your organization, Viets for Afghans, has done incredible work resettling 9 families, I think 59 people, is that right? Tell us about that experience, how it came to be, and what you guys have been doing over the past year and a half.
Yeah, I think that the story of Viets for Afghans is very much what can private citizens do when there is a international humanitarian crisis. And when you take a look at what was happening in August of 2021, we knew that all we knew was that, very similar to the Vietnam War, we knew that there was a large group of refugees or parolees or people who were seeking safety. We knew that they were coming. And so a group of friends and I were all Vietnamese American. We were all either refugees or children of refugees. And we felt a need to come together to do something. And so what it started off as is let's try to host these families, just as people hosted Vietnamese refugees. Let's try to do that. And so we came up with this. It was a little bit of a gimmick, but we wanted to raise awareness and attention, and we called it the 75 for 75 project, because Vietnamese refugees started coming at the very end of the Vietnam War, April 30th, 1975. Why don't we try to sponsor 75 Afghan refugees and have them hosted by 75 Vietnamese refugees? And that was to just raise awareness. And in a lot of ways it worked, because I think the Afghan community was so in such trauma at the time that the media and communities were looking for someone to help make sense of what was happening. And so that was the role that we could serve, having lived through a similar experience. And so the advocacy part came out of that, the practical support, trying to provide funding for housing or actual emergency housing, learning very quickly what was going on within the current landscape. We all appreciate our resettlement agencies. They're incredible, but they've also been through a lot. They've been put through the ringer, completely decimated by presidential administrations over the last many years. And in that case, they were not really prepared, to take this influx, to receive this influx of refugees. And so as private citizens, we felt, what could we do? So we kind of kept an eye out for that. And at that time, the State Department was experimenting and released information about a pilot project that would allow these small private sponsorship circles. And we decided, hey, we've got this shared lived experience and we have a desire to help, and we could help to test this out. So we decided to go for it. And so Viets for Afghans, with the support of a fiscal sponsor, with a network of people who really at that time didn't know what we were doing, just knew we had a shared lived experience and a desire to help, we raised the money to help to resettle families that were currently on military bases around the country. So we formed in August of 2021. By October, we learned about this sponsor pilot program. By December, we were at the airport picking up our first family that was coming here. And then over the course of the next 2 months, 3 months after that, we picked up like 8 more families. And so it was, and I don't think that we even had time to breathe or to even fully understand what we were doing. I think there was a ton of good intent that was there, and the community interest and outpouring of support of not just time, but of monetary donations, of physical donations. We immediately got a storage unit and, filled that up with things that we could give away to refugees. It was a real whirlwind, and we were learning as we went. And I think that what kept us going through that, and it was challenging at times as well, because you're dealing with real lives. And I think for us as refugees, it was like for the Vietnamese people who were involved, I think what you kind of learn is, wow, this is re-triggering for us. Like we were triggered by those images we saw like on the news, which drove us to want to take action. But then you see what these people are going through. And I think for a lot of us, it took a real heavy toll on me. And thank goodness I go to therapy every week, because I started realizing, and my therapist helped me to see, she's like, you're on this hamster wheel. And I think you're trying to process your own family's trauma still. And it was true. And so you understand that about yourself. And for our group, what it became very organically was not just Vietnamese volunteers, but it was the non-Vietnamese volunteers who also stepped up in a huge way. And I'm talking, Chinese Americans, Caucasian, white men, my white men and women. It's like, it wasn't just Vietnamese. It became sort of a coalition. If you believe in this mission of helping refugees quickly, having a direct line to them, then get involved with us. And I think having a range of volunteers, a network of people who were working, not working, retired, between jobs, having that diversity ended up becoming a little bit of a superpower for us. And we started meeting like weekly, monthly, just to try to communicate with each other. And we learned very quickly, this is not easy. And in a lot of ways, I think it helped us to look at the existing, like I have a whole new admiration for our resettlement system, because it's not easy. And to be able to provide help and support to real people and to do it in an equitable way, we had to learn some hard lessons the hard way, because we became so attached to our 59 refugees and our 9 families that we had to remind ourselves there are thousands more out there. So having to learn that in real time when you have an emotional connection to these families was super fascinating. But what we realized also was that Viets for Afghans we wanted to be around, not to be a nonprofit per se, long-term, but to address a need as it came up. And so actually the end of our story is actually, we know what the conclusion is, because we decided that we are a mutual aid project. And we decided that we did not want to become an official nonprofit long-term. We would exist as long as there was a need. And so we actually sunsetted the project late fall of last year. We wanted to make sure we provided support to our families for the initial 90 days. We went beyond that and continued to help a lot of our families. And to this day, we're still supporting. Some of our volunteers are so passionate and so committed that not only are they helping those 59, within like the official group of refugees that we sponsored, but they're helping a lot more, like other Afghan refugees who they've met along the way. And so just kudos to those folks for the commitment and the time that they put into this. And I'm really proud of what we did. I feel that, we made an impact in the way that we could, and we tried to sunset the project responsibly. And also understanding too, that we had an opportunity to continue to advocate whenever we are needed, because we still support refugees. And we had a responsibility to help to expand capacity within the Afghan community, because one of the big learnings for us was the Vietnamese community had to learn, sometimes the hard way, but we had to learn how to support each other. And the resettlement of Vietnamese and refugees from Southeast Asia for the 20, 30 years after the end of the Vietnam War was very much a grassroots thing. And so it's time for us as a community to try to help to build the Afghan community and help them to understand what are the opportunities. And so we have raised quite a bit of money, but we've actually given a lot of that money to local organizations that are led by and serving Afghan refugees, so that we could, I think, like Viets for Afghans, we had to be realistic that it's not, we could not sustain ourselves as a mutual aid volunteer run project in the long term. So that was the decision we made, was that we would give whatever funding we had toward advocating for Afghan refugees. So that's where we are.
Thank you, Ton. And I just want to put a plug in. First of all, I think it's very unusual for an organization to realize that they are a defined time period project and to sunset. And I think that takes courage. So I think congratulations for actually realizing that and coming to that realization. The other thing I just want to say is you all learned so much, apologies for the dog, that you decided to share that knowledge. And one of the things that you did decide to provide some funding for is a website for Afghans to be able to access information on housing, how to take driver's lessons, where to get prenatal support, all of the myriad things, food for, special halal food, food for Ramadan, if you're food insecure, like all the things that come once you're settling in a community and may not have full employment. So that's been really great. And I know it's not completely launched yet, but it's going to be an incredible resource. So very cool. All right. So let's move in. We're going to get to your questions in a moment, but I have kind of one primary last question before we do that, which is a little bit of the tensions in some of the models. So you've heard from 3 very different perspectives: government, nonprofit, and then the private citizen perspective. And they all need to work together, but there's tensions in each of the models. And so what I'm going to ask each of you to do is to talk a little bit about some of those tensions that arise in supporting Afghans. And we've touched on a couple of those things already. But Erin, maybe starting with you and the work that World Relief has done, can you talk a little bit about some of the complexities in the model that World Relief has and how that intersects with some of the other work that's being done by some of these other groups?
Yeah, I think I really liked your point, Ton. We're working with people, and I think that's the biggest. It sounds like a bit of a duh moment. Yeah, you're working with people, but it's two-tiered of you're sitting in front of someone and they're expressing extreme emotional distress and trauma, and they're looking at you and they're saying, you help me. You're here, you're here to help me, right? I got here and I'm in front of you and now you help me. And all of us in any parts of our roles are handcuffed by our limitations, whether it's funding, whether it's political apathy, whether it's even the mission of our organization, or if it's just timing. Like there's an overwhelm. The biggest thing that, I'm fairly new to the organization, so I wasn't here for the big part of the APA program, the Afghans placement Operation Allies Welcome, but I did inherit a team that had gone through that. And like you said, Ton, it was a very traumatized group of people who had worked with huge like just the number of people that we dealt with and that were in front of us that we wanted to help was way more than we could really serve. So it felt like we were sort of fighting this uphill battle where we were trying to do all we could for our participants with limited money, with Seattle being a unrealistic market to be self-sufficient in. That's kind of what our goal is, to get people to be self-sufficient, which means they're making enough money to keep themselves and their family well. That is nearly impossible in Seattle, where, families' rent is $4,000 a month. So I think a big tension there is the limitations, whether it's financial or just overwhelm. Every system has been overwhelmed. Every refugee touching system has been overwhelmed since November 2021. And then with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Washington specifically has had a huge proportion of Ukrainians here since the fall of the Soviet Union. So we have had we call it a pipeline, which is just like one person in the US who has ties to somewhere elsewhere and they come and join each other. So the pipeline here for Ukrainians is massive. And they're not quite being served in the same way as Afghans were. There's limited support for them. Most of them aren't even coming through resettlement. They're being sponsored by their family members, by their neighbors, who are financially supporting them with very little parameters. So we're doing our best to offer whatever supports we can in that. But yeah, I think the biggest kind of tensions we find are the limitations surrounding us, which is funding, the fact that you can't find affordable housing. Political, it can always be political of, we are in I guess we say this is a feast or famine kind of job. Right now, we have money. We never have money. So we're trying to build infrastructure. We're trying to create programs. We're trying to get as much money out to the communities as we can. We have a rental assistance program, which has only been a dream for the last 20 years. We actually can hand out rent, which is shocking. But we know, and we're keeping our eye on the horizon, that is not a long-term thing. We're already seeing our funding being cut for the next financial year because, as we all know, refugees and welcoming refugees is something that's highly politicized, and each administration addresses it very differently. And so because there's been two massive refugee crises in the last 3 years, there's been a lot of money poured into it, which means we have increased our capacity a lot. We now need to think about how do we make sure we're sustainable for this period in front of us, which may not be as generous as it was before. We're watching very interested at this new community sponsorship program. There's been very little communication with the government to us, because we're technically contractors of the government to resettle refugees, about what our role will be in this process. I believe our role is going to be technical support. So we're thinking around how we can support these community-led groups in their community sponsorship using our technical expertise, and how do we make sure that these families that come this way have the same equitable access as people that come through resettlement agencies. Yeah, that's just the tip of the iceberg. If there's any questions, I'm happy to clarify.
Thanks, Erin. That was really helpful. And you hit on a lot of things. And Luana, I'm going to turn to you. And one of the things that you mentioned, besides the issue of trying to understand which immigrants and refugees you even need to translate for, and trying to come up with a way to do that to make sure that the city is accessible. You mentioned the legal issues, and we didn't really get into the legal definitions, and I don't think we're going to have time for that here, but I do want to say that most of the people who've come in the last few years are on a very temporary status. Can you talk a little bit about some of the tensions around that and how the city of Seattle is actually working through the legal defense network and some of the legal representation, and then feel free to add on other tensions that you see, but that was one that stood out.
Yeah,
that we have to
absolutely.
cover.
Yeah, I think ultimately the tension is between jurisdictions. All the decisions made about immigration are at the federal level. And so as a city government, we can sign, we can submit public comment, we can send letters, we can talk to our legislators, but ultimately we cannot change federal policy, in a direct way that we can with city policy. And so I think part of what, when a city or a state or a county says they're a welcoming county, what they're basically trying to do is fill the gaps left behind by the federal government. And so with something like the Legal Defense Network, what I don't think many people are aware of is that immigration infractions are considered civil infractions, not criminal infractions. And so when you are going through an immigration process like potential deportation, or any time that you have to appear in front of an immigration judge, no one needs to provide you with an attorney if you can't afford your own. It's not like Miranda rights, or you get arrested by the police and you have right to an attorney. So if you're a 9-year-old El Salvadorian boy who escaped gang violence and made your way to the border, and you're in deportation proceedings and you don't speak English, you very likely could be forced to appear in front of a judge. There will likely be an interpreter if Spanish is your primary language. If you speak a native language from Central America, they may not have an appropriate interpreter for you. And so that's what we're trying to do, right, with the Legal Defense Network, is say that this is unacceptable, that every person deserves legal representation to go through these very complex processes and institutions. And so we have carved out some funding to be able to provide that to people in our region. But it's a constant battle, and it's a lot of scarcity. And I hate to feed into this scarcity mindset, but the reality is that there is not enough funding. I think to Erin's point, housing is becoming coming increasingly on our radar. It's not something our office has really worked on historically, but what we're seeing is that with people seeking asylum, people on some of the parole programs that have been established for different countries, the process between actually arriving and having a work permit can take a really long time. Right now, you have to wait 180 days after applying for asylum before you can even apply for your work permit, which then could take another 90 days. And so So what we're seeing is that whereas in the past, people would arrive to this region with some local connections, some kind of informal network. So for my family, two of my uncles were living in Seattle when my family settled here. And then, you know, a cousin comes and the uncle comes and the neighbor. And what we're seeing is that folks are arriving here and they do not have that. And so more and more, they're showing up at Mary's Place. They're showing up at all these different community-based organizations that are sort of beholden by their funding to do things a different way, right? So Mary's Place can't just say we have a bed. There's a whole centralized system to access those resources. And it's not accessible to people who are undocumented, people who are waiting for their asylum applications to go through. And so it's a bit of a whack-a-mole where our office is often required to be really reactive. It's hard to plan ahead because immigration systems and regulations change frequently. So I now feel like I'm just kind of ranting, but yeah, I think that is the tension, right? Ultimately, what we'd love to see is comprehensive immigration reform that really, you know, works our way out of a job, right? Where every single department is being really meticulous about doing due diligence about what the immigrants and refugees that they serve need in terms of language access, in terms of services, in terms of representation. And so I'll just stop there.
Thanks, Yolanda. Appreciate the candor with which you're sharing your experience and the perspective from the city. Tan, talk to us a little bit about the complexities that you see in the role that you've played, both, I think, as a member of Viets for Afghans, but also as a filmmaker who've been, you know, documenting the lives of real people. And Mary, maybe you or Anna can even add to the chat so we can make sure this is on people's radar, the KCTS program that I mentioned at the beginning. It's amazing and inspiring. And I think you've probably learned even more from that process. So would love to just hear your thoughts about some of the challenges that you've seen and complexities of working in this space.
Yeah, I think that, you know, I'll add on to what Luanda and Aaron, you know, were saying, but I mean, the tension that I feel is just, it's like we are, for those who are working directly with these individuals and with these families, it is so hard because each of them, each case is so different, each person's case is different and circumstances different. And to try to help them, you know, I look at our volunteers who stepped up and are so committed, and yet everybody was like, they're spinning because they're like, I'm worried about, you become so consumed by like one individual or one family circumstance. And then we miss the big picture, which is like, this is a systemic issue and a major failing. You know, I mean, we've got our 9 families, like we're very concerned about their legal status because they are all still here on a temporary basis. And they're all concerned, and we've tried to get legal support for all of them. We have tried to convince each of them, do not pay. You don't have the money, you know, so like, do not pay for legal services. That's not going to fast track this for you. And let's try to get you pro bono support and help. But it's really hard to be like watching everybody spin and run circles and try to like reinvent the wheel over and over and over again, when what we need is for the federal government to just provide blanket protection for all of the Afghans who have come here. Like that would save so much time, energy, resource, and money. Like it just makes too much sense. And yet it's like, we're not seeing that get done. And it's so frustrating. And I think that the other thing too is, the concern that I have is this pitting of refugees against each other, because we have to operate with a scarcity mindset. And I think it's really awful, quite frankly, for Afghans to be concerned about like, well, is it because of the Ukrainians? Like, is that taking attention away from us? And or why are they getting the help that we're not getting? And it's so hard because people don't have visibility and the same access to the same information. So there's just a ton of confusion and misinformation. You mix that with trauma and like serious mental health issues, you know, and it's a disaster. And so it's a disaster. And I feel that And I guess I think a lot about like, how could this have been prevented? But since we can't prevent it, we are where we are. It's been a year and a half now since the fall of Kabul. It's been like a little more than a year since the war in Ukraine. And we've got refugees from all these other countries as well. Sort of like, what can we wrap our heads around? Like, what is within our control? Like, what can we do right now? And for me, I mean, I just had to think about it personally as someone who's trying to do something in this space. It becomes like, I only have so much energy. So where can I have the most impact? And where can I utilize my skill set? And personally, for me as a communicator and as a filmmaker, it was through this docuseries for KCTS, where we could take a look, in these 8.5-minute episodes, like we could try to break down what was going on with the Afghan refugees in a way that is snackable for people. And hopefully they kind of see it and understand, and it generates discussion and awareness, because I think that's what we need, is we need people to care. We need people to know what is happening, so that then we can sort of chip away and maybe, fix the system little by little. But I mean, it is frustrating. And so I don't know, it's been challenging to watch, and I wish I had more solutions. But, what I do hope is that by at least trying to understand the bigger picture and to tell a few stories and to humanize what the refugees are going through, I hope that just piques people's interest, and they're like, maybe I can get involved. Maybe I can apply some pressure to my lawmakers. Maybe I can go volunteer. I mean, it's like, we just need all hands on deck. It's like, I really reject this tension between the organizations too. It's like, this is not about the private resettlement versus the resettlement agencies. This is not, it has to be like, we just all have to work together if we're going to make this work, and It's for Afghans we're not here to try to supplant, the resettlement agencies. We're here to try to like supplement what they are doing. It's just all hands on deck. Everybody has different skill levels, bandwidth, capacity to take action in whatever way makes sense for them. And so anyway, I don't know that addresses your question. That's just,
no, I think that's great. I mean, this is the reality. This is the reality. And Anna, could you add the slide? I want to make sure that we have a chance to answer any burning questions folks have, but we did put together some ways that you can get engaged. And I think as we're thinking about questions, if you can show that on the screen, that would be great. We've highlighted the docuseries that Tan directed on KCTS. Definitely encourage you to watch it. Aaron mentioned the new US sponsorship program where private citizens can come together. That's listed at the bottom. That's called Welcome Corps. And it's really what Yes for Afghans was sort of piloting. And in the future, the goal for the US government is to actually be able to have people sponsor named refugees. So someone that you would like to bring to the US because they're being persecuted and can prove that. So then the third area, and as Impact 100 and really invested in these community-based organizations personally, I want to make sure that we mention there's a whole lot of them. These are just a few who applied for our grant this year. Each of them has a specific focus on serving refugees and immigrants in different ways. Some of them through making things like Refugee Artisan Initiative, some of them for advocating in schools like Para los Niños, helping women drive, Mujer al Volante. They don't necessarily focus on a specific type of refugee or immigrant from a specific location, but they are the all hands on deck that Tan is talking about in providing these other supports that, frankly, the private government and refugee resettlement agencies aren't able to provide. So definitely encourage you to check some of them out. And again, while we're having you take a look at this, would be great to get any questions that we can answer. We're a small group. You feel free to put it in the chat or just take yourself off mute and ask a question, because you've got some great panelists. Manuela, I see, has a question. So why don't you dive in?
Can you hear me?
Keep it short because we only have a few minutes left.
I will try. It's actually a short question. It's for Tan. I'm particularly interested in, thank you for putting the Welcome Corps org URL out here. I'm really interested in how other groups of private citizens can learn from your group's experience and leverage the learning. So I am actually from Europe, which has seen the largest influx of refugees since the start of the Ukraine war. And one of the problems that especially groups of private citizens are dealing with right now is what's called refugee fatigue. People are extremely tired of what's going on. So how can other groups of citizens learn from your organization, even though it may not be defunct?
Yeah, I mean, I would go to our website, vietsforafghans.org. We've kept it very simple. On our homepage is our story of how we came together, how we did what we did, and hopefully that provides some lessons for people. We've actually engaged with the State Department, the Community Sponsorship Hub, which is overseeing the private resettlement matching program. We are engaged with them. We have tried to share our learnings with them as well. We also have, and you'll see a link on this from our website as well. There was a University of Washington Evans School. They had a graduate student group for their capstone project. They studied us and they looked at us and what was going on during our time when we were super active, and they came up with a report with some really interesting learnings as well. So I would look for that link. But we're here and we're trying to share with as many people as possible the pros, some of the cons. We just want people to have a full view that this is what this work is, and it can get really tiring, exhausting, and we have a lot of lessons that we can share. So I would encourage you to go to our website, take a look at that capstone report, and also the Welcome Corps. They've been putting together a lot of resources to really help to prepare these circles as best they can. So just take a look at all of that. And if you still have questions, my email is here, and I'm happy to connect people with some of our very experienced volunteers who have done this work, because they're really great resources as well.
Thank you.
And I
helpful.
think there's one more slide with our emails if you want to just pop that on real quick.
Thank you.
And thank you for the question.
Yeah, Kira, you have a question. Kira, can you hear me? Hello? Uh-oh.
Did we lose
Hello?
Kira?
Oh, can you hear me now?
There you go. Okay.
Sorry,
I wasn't
sorry.
sure if it was me.
No, sorry.
Okay, great.
I'm wondering if there's any sort of like Emily's List style guide or anything like that that like helps people in local and wider elections if they want to be proactive on this issue.
So from our side, World Relief Western Washington is a part of World Relief, which is an international organization. So the majority of our advocacy happens at the DC level, at the national level. But our office here is really interested in doing more advocacy here. I come from an advocacy background, so it's been something I've been trying to push. As Melissa noted, the Afghan Adjustment Act, which was where we had pinned all of our hopes on, which would adjust the statuses that the Afghans had to something more sustainable and less unstable, which it currently is, that didn't pass. And it seems as though there's not enough political will. So we're looking into how that might work. Something we've been encouraged by our state refugee coordinator, who is kind of the person here in Washington State, is to do advocacy here at Washington State around especially things like work permits, access to housing, things that can be done here at a state level. We're thinking about jumping into that pool right now, but we haven't yet. And I can't point you in the direction of that right now. I know MAPS does quite a lot, which I think Melissa can speak to. But it's a hard space to be in because it's not hard, but Seattle is a very welcoming place, or Washington is a very welcoming state. So we're often not arguing about something. We're just trying to make something a little bit better or to encourage slightly more inclusive language. But yeah, I don't know, Melissa, you might be able to speak better to that.
Yeah, I'll let Luwanda chime in since she's had her hand up, and then I can close this off.
Sure. I would suggest connecting or getting on the WISEN mailing list. WISEN stands for the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network. They started out during the Trump administration as a hotline to report ICE activity and have evolved since then. They essentially do like a resource a helpline for immigrants and refugees, and they do a ton of advocacy. So they were very involved in advocating for healthcare for Apple Health is access for undocumented folks in this last state legislative session, and unemployment insurance, where if you are undocumented, even if the unemployment insurance is taken out of your paycheck, you do not have access to that if you're let go. So waisn.org. I'll put it in the chat.
That's great. Thank you.
And I think that caps us off. This is a great discussion. I knew we would only scratch the surface. There's so much more to cover, but what an amazing group of people to bring together and tell stories about your experiences. And I just thank you all for coming to this with such grace and humility and love and support. And we know that the work that you're doing is really incredibly hard, but we know also that our communities are better off when they include immigrants and refugees. So thank you all and have a great rest of your day. I know you'll be seeing some follow-up from the Impact 100 Seattle folks.
Thanks, everybody.